This is going to be on qualitative research and specifically on case studies. Most of the qualitative research that we're going to do in social work is going to be around case studies, although we do engage in focus groups at times. Less often do we do ethnography or grounded theory, but we're going to go briefly over qualitative research and then specifically into the case study. And the article chosen this week is a case study, so you can become familiar with what that looks like in a published research perspective. So when we look at qualitative research, we actually have to look what our purpose is for our study, or we think about that research process model and we think about what is our question here. And we engage in qualitative research if we really want the lived experience of the individual, a deep contextual understanding of their experience of whatever it is we're investigating. The benefits of that is we do get that rich understanding, that deep context that's generated. And the limitations include some subjectivity. When we're talking about quantitative, we have objectivity. When we're talking about qualitative, we have subjectivity. There's limited generalizability. Obviously, we can't take what we learn from a handful of individuals and apply it to a larger amount of the population. And the large, copious amounts of data that is collected. Oftentimes, students think they want to do qualitative because there's no quote-unquote numbers involved like there is in statistics. We tend to be very scared of statistics. Qualitative data collection and data analysis is much more extensive, involved, and complicated than running statistics in a software program. So if you're choosing qualitative for that reason, that is not a reason to choose qualitative. The reasons to choose qualitative is to answer a question that's going to give you a very rich understanding, in-depth, contextual picture of what that individual is experiencing. So when we think about it, we think about what is our question? What is the question we're trying to answer for our research? Well, it could be to inform a topic where there's very little known about the topic. We are right now in a real life experiment, if you will, in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So there's a variety of areas out there where we could delve into some qualitative research to get a better understanding of the lived experiences of individuals who have had COVID or who have lost someone to COVID or who have been isolated and have other mental health challenges. There's a lot of things here that we're living right now that we know very little about because of the COVID pandemic. So that's just a real world example. We also may have a question and we want to really understand a complex situation that's constantly changing. So the purpose is to determine what that situation looks like now as opposed to maybe what it looked like a year ago, 5 years ago. So we need that more in-depth understanding. Or it could be our interest and our question is around studying participants' reactions in their natural setting or their process as opposed to a laboratory controlled objective type setting. If the goal is to develop new explanatory theory that's generalized to reality or lived experience, theory is developed through qualitative research. Okay, and that's generally your ethnography, your grounded theory, those methodologies, phenomenological. So theory comes from qualitative research. When we generate theory, we then move into quantitative research and begin to quantify what we've learned from that theory and expand it to larger populations. So qualitative is the route for theory development. Or if the aim is to cultivate a deep understanding of certain human phenomenon. So these are the areas we would look at and why we would choose a qualitative research approach. So if our question falls into one of these areas, we might want to consider a qualitative research approach or a mixed methods approach where you include both. So then how do we come about answering our question in qualitative? And in qualitative research, the question is going to be just a little bit different than it is in quantitative. You're not really going to have variables that you're going to identify ahead of time. It may be a broader question, a little bit more abstract, not as concrete or worded in a hypothesis format. So how do we answer our question? Well, we look at the different ways we can collect data. First of all, we can do individual interviews, and this is one of the most common ways that we do it in social work. We can do focus groups. There's observation, where you can actually create and design a qualitative study and do observation. Observation happens a lot in early childhood, in classrooms, in the school settings, things like that would be an observation. Or out in the field, observing public behavior, that would be a qualitative approach. Field journals are also a way to collect data. And then you can also review existing records. And qualitative research has been done over, say, there's journals that have been collected during the Civil War, and there can be qualitative work done there analyzing all the massive text that was written by different individuals. So these would be ways that we would collect data to answer our question. So how do we get individuals to participate? How do we know which individuals can answer our question? And there's different sampling designs in qualitative. Sampling designs allow us to either generalize beyond the sample, where we use random sampling, or they're sampling that we can't do that. And in qualitative, we're going to use purposive sampling, which means we have specific characteristics of individuals that we want to participate. So we're going to only invite those very specific individuals to participate. Snowball sampling is typically done whenever you have a marginalized population that's difficult to access, an underrepresented group. So if you're interviewing transgendered individuals on a college campus, let's just say that's the population you're needing to get to, you may identify one or two individuals and then ask them, do you have friends, do you have others that you know that could also participate in this? So it's a snowball process. Deviant cases is where you actually would choose those cases that lie outside of what you're looking at. And quota sampling is a way where you get a specific number of individuals who have specific characteristics that you're looking for. So these are very deliberate ways of sampling, and because they're very deliberate, very specific, they're not going to represent the larger population. So you can't generalize your findings from your qualitative study to that larger population based on your sampling procedures here. Accessing participants, again, that's going to be a challenge when you're talking qualitative, and there has to be a great deal of ethical consideration in this because there's not going to be anonymity. Confidentiality is of utmost importance, but you're going to have to gain trust of an individual to be able to give you the full context, the deep, rich information that you're looking for. They're not going to be able to hide who they are behind a questionnaire. So accessing participants can be a lot more daunting, and you may have to actually meet them ahead of time, build some rapport, establish that relationship before they can agree to become a part of your study, which then impacts subjectivity. This is not an objective approach at all. It impacts subjectivity. There's a bias that's entered into this. And this is all known and understood from a qualitative standpoint. It's not negative, but when you start analyzing your data, there are ways to kind of control for some of this and to eliminate some of the bias and to check things and make sure you're being accurate. But this is actually a way where the researcher really enmeshes themselves in the research process. So again, the methods of how I will answer my question, what you can choose from is the case study, and that's kind of what we're focusing on this week is the case study. The ethnography, and that really more comes from a sociological perspective, but it is used some, especially in social work areas where we may be working with indigenous populations in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. Grounded theory is well known primarily in the feminist studies. Grounded theory is emerged, I want to say there, and it became more apparent there. But grounded theory is actually where you begin to generate hypotheses to inform theory, and then to be able to move into a quantitative research area, and then phenomenology. So these are the areas that you would look at and the different methods you would choose to look at your ways to answer your question and analyze your data. Social work typically looks at case studies or grounded theory, but most of the time it's case studies, and that's why our focus is more on case study this week. So what is a case study? Well, a case study centers on an individual, a family, who are seeking social work services. This is from a social work perspective, okay? So we're going to center on just that individual or just that family. We're going to document extensive background information, his history, their history, the relationships. We may use tools such as the genogram or the culturogram or some of those other tools that are available. We look at the environmental context and we look at the reasons they're seeking services. So we're going to have a very rich, in-depth case file on the individual or on the family that we're investigating. We're going to document the process of intervention in a very detailed way, and we're going to record and keep the records of the services, and this will allow us to, in the future, hypothesize reasons why the interventions worked or didn't work. That can also inform additional studies down the road, and again, moving into quantitative if we need to do that. But doing a case study within our agency type settings is very doable, kind of like the single subject design. It's very doable for us to be able to gather good, rich data and make some good informed decisions and then inform future evidence building. So that's why the case study is important to social work. The case study is very different from the single subject design. A single subject design is actually considered a quantitative method, not a qualitative method, because the single subject design, you're going to analyze data in terms of numbers. Even though some of it's not complex analysis, it can become that way. So the single subject design is really a quantitative approach, and it follows that methodology in building it, whereas the case study is a qualitative approach, and it follows the qualitative methodology in terms of building the study. So you're going to begin with some literature review, but not a complete literature review. You're going to have a broader research question. It's not going to have variables. You're going to have a very specific population that you're going to seek the participants from. You're going to have a limited number of participants, and you're going to have massive amounts of text data that you're going to have to go through and analyze. You're going to do a round robin, and what that means is as you begin doing interviews, say you've done 2 or 3 really in-depth interviews and you've started analyzing your data, you're going to go back to the literature and you're going to find more evidence to tie in and support that data and inform your future interviews. So it's a very interactive process in terms of the qualitative approach, which differs from the quantitative approach. Our case studies can actually be exploratory, and again, we're just kind of exploring. We don't have enough information to make hypotheses or develop study questions that are going to ask about variables that could interact with each other. It can inform explanatory, and if we go back, it can actually become explanatory for theory and informing the theory that can then move on to more what we call advanced type of research studies, which gets into the quantitative area. And we can also use it to understand larger systems such as organizations and communities. Backing up to the explanatory, if you do a multiple case studies, like you have for a year, you did in-depth case studies on a sample of your client population, and you saw those patterns emerging as to what works and what doesn't work based on the rich data that you've collected about their history and their relationships and everything. That can help you start explaining and providing evidence for what works in your agency. So explanatory is going to be for theory, and then if you actually do it continuously, you can then begin to develop enough evidence to say this provides some explanatory. Once you get all that data, you have to go through it so you can actually answer your question. There's preparing the data, and this has to do with oftentimes transcribing it if you've recorded it. It has to be in a way that it can be analyzed. There are some software programs that will use the qualitative data and help analyze it, but it does have to be organized and prepared. Then when you analyze it, you're going to actually begin looking for those themes, start organizing the concepts and the patterns that are out there, and then you're going to develop the story from what you have to tell the story about what you learned. There are ways to validate your conclusions and to make sure that you're being as objective as possible. Triangulation's one, and that's where you look at different forms of data to validate what you have. Respondent validation, member checking, that's where you actually go back to your participants. And when you go back to your participants, you say, this is what I understood from what you told me. Am I correct? And then explicit accounting of the methods for data collection and analysis. And that means that you're actually going to be very explicit and detailed in terms of how you collected your data, how you analyzed it, so that others will know that you followed some systemic way of doing that. And then you're going to report your findings. And the findings typically are reported in a narrative type form where you bring in quotations from those that you collected data from to support your interpretation of it. So again, this is much more of a narrative storytelling type, but there is a systemic way to do it and follow it through.